I have been looking at my psychological structures, and it really it takes me a long time because I'm having to sort of absorb the huge volume of sort of structure that my models have and my different models have, and sort of bring it together and try to sort of make sense of it. And um, at this point, I'm also sort of looking for things that look egregiously wrong, so I can work out if I've been wasting my time, and that the whole system is fundamentally kind of built on some kind of stupid assumption or error somewhere that's somewhat lurking. But and there were certain things that I was sort of agnostic about as I was building my models, that knowing that some elements of them might have a measure of the kind of delicate sophistication of the thing that I'm modeling, but that they might need to be extended, like they might not be broad enough. Like one of those ideas was that the 12 model emotional tones in metagram might be a particular, there might be more ways in which that those emotional so it says that there might be more emotional tones in some way, or that they might be the same emotional tones that are constructed from different cognitive functions, which is that breaks my whole definitional matrix of how I've structured my model. But that there might be a different stacking, there might be an alternative arrangement of which might be fundamentally distinct. Like there might be 24 emotional tones, and then there might be a kind of substitute, an complete substitute of another 24 emotional tones that are arranged differently or constructed differently. But that is, in some sense, um, that's the kind of doubt that someone has to rationally have, that in terms of, well, if you don't have perfect knowledge of other people's minds, you might just be trapped within a particular vocabulary, within a particular system, and there's an alternative system that your mind isn't connected to. And so you just kind of almost, in the same way that on some technical rational level you might have to doubt whether there are other intelligent minds in the world, whether you're the only one with consciousness, like the kind of the rational, hard, skeptical solipsism, doubting whether there are other minds. In the same way, you could perhaps wonder if there are completely alternative structures. So I've always had something like that as a possibility, that there might be sort of two possible pantheons for cognition. Um, I mean, I consider that to be a little bit wild, and in some sense, but that it's a technical possibility, um, because when I look at the emotional tone model, in terms of the field circuits and how the field circuits somewhat also in a more complicated level intersect with one another because of symmetries and asymmetries between, let's say, other ways of subcategorizing the cognitive functions that make up the field circuits. Um, it's very quaint. It's very, the structure itself is very sort of, it's very human. You could almost say that this is the formula of all archetype, and all narratives and all plots are all stylistically comprised of these ingredients. And it just seems quite, it's obviously complicated, and in terms of how it can be stylistically, formulaically manifested into a particular permutation of a narrative or something like that, it can certainly be very complicated, because you can kind of go all the way around. I mean, between these 12 nodes that are interlocked with these different irregular intersections and interconnections with one another, it's a very, it's like looking at a very particular game. If this is the game of karma, and it actually has very particular rooms, it has very particular sort of gradients of one-way filters in those rooms. It's like a very, it's like setting up a complicated circuit and then saying, well, that's all there is. You can pass through those things but you can also go from one room to the next, back to the one room, back to the next room, and then go on a detour and then go back to the first room, and so you can kind of meander around and go back and forth and back and forth. So there's a kind of infinite combinatorial, sort of way of sequencing through it. Anyway, so anyway, one of the properties that has stuck up in my mind recently is that in my metagram circuits, in my empirical recording of people's personality styles, I sort of came up with the observation essentially that there is always an inverse alchemical correlation. No, that's not even. I'll have to check the tables, but yeah, I think that there's an alchemical. It's between, I think, between the stimulus and the primary counteroffer. Oh man, I should be looking at the tables for this. But between the primary counteroffer and the emergent response, because sometimes the emergent response has two emotional tones, not one, and so one of the emergent responses relative to the primary counteroffer is an alchemical elemental inverse of the primary counteroffer, and then the other one can be different. And then when I think that there is a different second one there, because obviously it can't be the same thing twice. So if there are two emotional tones in the emergent response, one of them isn't going to be an inverse. So the one that isn't an inverse is a correlate of the other emergent response, which is the inverse to the primary counteroffer. So that means that essentially the emergent response, when it does come as two emotional tones, is coming as a pair, and that pair has an equal correspondence to the primary counteroffer via the kind of alchemical. Anyway, so I haven't exactly lined this up, but there's probably, well, this will either confirm the system or show the system to be shoddy or whatever, that in terms of the field circuit layout, there should be a kind of, what is it, things should be equally adjacent to one another. How the primary counteroffer is connected to these things is connected to the emergent response, and then the second emergent response emotional tone, that they should be that they should be placed in such a way so as to accord to that. And then you can that should potentially make out the nodes in the field circuit model of emotional tones that are being almost like is if someone has a song in their head, but they don't remember all of the notes of the song. They only remember some of the notes of the song and the sequence that they come in, and so they're open to somebody else singing a chorus and singing a tune, but they just need to have the notes that they are reliant on performing need to not be obviated or trodden on by any joint narrative that they might sort of be singing in unison with somebody else in. And so it might be more than that, though. It might be that people actually require other people to fill in some kinds of, that they, therefore, they look for other people to provide emotional tones that end up being stepping stones between their notes that they have within essentially the model of the metagram field circuit. So they have their notes which they need interwoven, that they need connected. And so that people therefore would have a kind of dependence on externally generated or provided emotional tones that help them interconnect the notes that they need interconnected within themselves. And I mean, this simply comes from people not being able to, because there's more than one way to skin a cat, as it were. You could probably start to uncover how to make yourself no longer a dependent on external energy by being able to internally create or generate these emotional tones just by, in some sense, your own conscious fiat, your own ability to have a kind of mental mastery over mental objects like this. You could just kind of, obviously, you're still then a slave to energy, karmic energy in this sense, but at least it'll give you a mechanism over which that you can, on some gradient scale, work out that you can be self-sufficient or divested. Because again, I do think that all of the things like the emergent response, the primary counter offer, the stimulus, these are all emotional tones that are imprinted on the metatype sides of the mind, inferior functions of the various sides of the mind. And so in some sense, the metagram circuitry is how your false ego complex is operating in terms of its habitual cognitive styles and flows of cognition, and the metatype is in some sense the explanation as to why you are doing this to yourself. And so you can kind of gain a level of mastery over the mental cognition, over metagram, but in some sense that's just a kind of, well, hopefully that's a step as a means to an end in terms of resolving why it is that your metatype is addicted to essentially cycling this recurring emotional tone sort of argument that you're having with karma, that you're having with yourself, in terms of having to sort of break up your own sense of yourself so that you could play this game of sort of self disintegration, so that you're capable of in some sense perpetuating the illusion of an external locus of control that gives you something to do. Because I mean, I do think on some level that I mean, people are probably inducted into the false ego complex in different kind of ways, but I think that it is interesting. I mean, I did try to come up with a generalized diagnosis that all false ego complexes are, in some sense, in the metagram perspective, in the metagram through the metagram lens, are perhaps structurally perpetuated or entrenched using the sixth dimension that you're sort of condescending and bored about something. And anyway, I mean, I'm going to sort of explore those kinds of things because they are a little bit interesting. They're almost like a kind of metaphysical philosophy in terms of emotional tones and understanding how some emotional tones are sort of more pervasively sort of, or at least connected with the idea of being incepted into a narrative or an external locus of control, and sort of, but anyway, I mean, those things are probably also quite tricky metaphysical or meta-ethic issues to tackle with, or because you have to kind of still be able to use emotional tones, and the emotional tones like being condescending and bored, all the emotional tones are very important. You can't just kind of blame one as being a kind of prime evil or something like that. Like they will each have their sort of their proper use. Um, but you know, in at least in with regard to sort of ideological inception into a narrative and displacing the Holy Ghost, or at least what I consider to be the proper doctrinal understanding of the Holy Ghost, that uh, knowledge claims and such, that kind of make understanding sort of a hypothetical, subordinated, um, or unimportant uh, anyway. But yeah, I mean, I think there are some general things that can be said about metagram circuitry in terms of just trying to maximize it towards some kind of optimum that would help be be a useful, not a sufficient condition, but being useful to propagating the right metatype ethical understanding of one's own structure, perhaps with also some particularized, pedagogy or understanding as to the structure of one's personality and things like that. So one can try to monitor and keep an eye on things, and then also see for yourself, gaining self insight, or so that one can be more able and responsible for one's inculcating a strident and forthright self-determinism, with a self-consistency, and an internal locus of control. But in developing towards those things, yeah, I think that generally you do want positive emotional tones, which come in sets of 3 in the field circuits, and then you will have inverse field circuit interference or feedback, and therefore you will have to have negative emotional tones, or negatory emotional tones, which aren't negative, not as in like pessimistic. They're negative in that they are kind of like filters of positive emotional charge. They are like gateways or filters. And so you need to have the right filter, the right judgmental gateway that is sustainable of positive emotional energy. So you need to have like a balance of, I mean, in some sense, this is perhaps metaphorically similar to how when people train in martial arts, they are often encouraged to have a soft form and a hard form. The hard form being for, sort of fitness and strength and stamina, and the soft form being sort of almost to maximize your connection to your own body, and the kind of, perhaps, the one is almost sort of more the parasympathetic nervous system, and the other one is the sympathetic, um, and that you can sort of do better when you're sort of the more ephemeral and unconscious ways in which that your body is regulated is anyway. So there's probably a kind of a physical metaphor in there, but anyway, it's not that important. But that also, because the negative, or I said this already, because there are the inverse connections between some of the field circuits mean that to have a positive flow of one field circuit is to have simultaneously a negative emotional tone on another field circuit. So that means that if you want positive energy flowing around one field circuit, there is going to be a sympathetic or corresponding or concordant negative inhibiting emotional tone in the other one, and inhibiting emotional tones will also, at the very least, I think, precipitate other negative emotional tones in the same field circuit, because I think that any inhibition in one arm will likely end up being replicated in the other negative emotional tones. And so watching how that is translated from one negative emotional tone to another negative emotional tone, so that actually it's being done consciously and deliberately, and that it's not just a kind of an unfaithful, almost viral propagation of some like, because you can filter one, in some sense, the harder you have the harder you filter one field circuit, the faster the positive energy can flow in another field circuit, because the positive connects with the negative. And so maybe you've got too much flow in another field circuit and too much inhibition in another one. And so, and that would also, I think, correspond to there being negative emotional tones in a field circuit that have been inflated or developed in such a way that is actually not considered, or really you can't really see deliberate intelligence has developed these filters. They were just there to gum up and to arrest the movement of one field circuit so as to give free fluid circulation of another field circuit. So the one field circuit is gaining the momentum that has been sapped or sucked out of another field circuit. And this also would correspond to why some people are so caustic towards other people, is because they have relegated a whole field circuit into being a kind of a power keg, a kind of a battery. Um, and this also slightly maybe updates some of my views on the metagram description of bipolar type 1, um, but not by much. I still think that essentially what bipolar is that you're getting a virtual alternative primary counter offer, which is essentially establishing a completely independent false ego complex. And essentially, I think that generally most people are going to, within their metagram circuitry, they are going to bully a field circuit. They are going to be, let's say, fast and loose with how they treat a particular field circuit. And because of, let's say, that intrinsic disrespect of that field circuit, or let's say shunting or diversionary blame or something like that on that field circuit, so that they can play a kind of a parasitic, anyway, that at least within the bipolar, that has the potential of having an alternative primary counteroffer, and they have seen things from that perspective. They have perhaps even emulated it within their own mind, that they know that it's a viable alternative to their own psychological schema, that then they have almost a kind of an imaginary alternative personality style, which they know is just as viable or valid as their own. And so they're actually keeping track of their own, let's say, injustice that they show to that other field circuit. And that sort of is a looming powder keg waiting to explode. And when it sort of holds enough potential energy to assail the rest of the alternative primary counteroffer, it takes control of the emergent response and the stimulus. The virtual primary counteroffer found in the other field circuit virtually takes control of the emergent response and the stimulus, and you have essentially a, a separate representation of the superego. So as if the so you have a kind of hijacked unconscious side of the mind. And in some sense, I think that this would also coincide with a kind of existential assault on the primary counter offer, that what I call the sacred contract, which essentially is the thing that is the contract between the superego and the ego in the development of the ego, which is something like the unconscious constitutional framework, to use a kind of political metaphor. It's kind of like a it's kind of like a covenant. It's like the thing that because the primary counter offer is essentially the representative of the superego in the three sides in the remaining three sides of the mind, the actual sort of false ego complex. And so this is so complicated. So the ego, and by extension, as a secondary consequence of this, the ego and the subconscious are beholden to identifying, having criteria to identify what essentially its unconscious should amount to, or should amount to fulfilling the sacred contract, this kind of covenant with the superego. And so, in some sense, that sacred contract gets fundamentally repudiated or revoked by a revolutionary alternative primary counteroffer that seeks to radically update the sacred contract, because it has, let's say, a mandate or a proof that the sacred contract is not capable of being executed, that it's fundamentally impossible. And the impossibility of performance of the sacred contract essentially leads the status of the entire false ego complex also, but in the first place, the primary counteroffer, becomes a kind of translucent. Um, there's almost a kind. It's strange because it's not a cognitive dissonance, but in performance, it's kind of a cognitive dissonance. That the validity of the false ego complex is fundamentally. Uh, it there's a realization that the whole false ego complex is essentially a void. Um, is void on the count of its impossibility. Um, this is a useless thing to talk about, to bring up, but there's a beautiful metaphorical example of this in Full Metal Alchemist, um, when human transmutation is attempted. Um, the door of truth becomes visible, and those who see through the door of truth, who see the true truth of fundamentally that undergirds the experience of life, then end up having to lose parts of their soul, because the parts of their soul that see the truth have to be locked away behind the door, so that one can continue in the false ego complex. So you end up losing an arm and a leg as the price of seeing the truth, because everything that the truth has touched in that sense, if you want to go back to a false ego, the false ego can't know that it itself is void and false, because otherwise it just can't operate. Or it has to be in some kind of quasi quest to find how to integrate the truth. So it has a kind of half-life, where it's cynically operating in tolerance of its own untruth or falsity. Anyway, this is somewhat archetypally very much related to the whole story of the quest for the philosopher's stone, the magnum opus. Which is slightly perhaps obscured in the narrative of Full Metal Alchemist, because essentially you have to kind of decode what it means to perform a human transmutation, to create a human life, to create a human consciousness. Which I'm arguing is basically a metaphor for understanding, sort of the divine spark of the depth of the human condition. Which, in some sense, which is, it's interesting how some things can be hidden within, let's say, the metaphor of a particular endeavor, of a particular project, of a particular thing to do, like creating human life, creating human transmutation is actually the larger question of the macrocosm, which or I mean, I'm arguing that these things converge within the realm of psychology, essentially. Um, or spiritual understanding, that they're all just metaphors of that fundamental level, um, of which you could call also spiritual alchemy, um, or hermetic alchemy. I mean, there are very interesting parallels, between, all the concepts within alchemy, like the rebus and things like that, and I do think that essentially that there are broader analogues to this uh, within the psychological and moral and ethical issues of how to frame a state so that there is an equal amount of masculine order to feminine potential, uh, that the kind of, the spiritual translation of, these sorts of things like gender is, is just the concept, or I mean, I say potential because I think that for potential to be alive, you need some level of, forbidden or imperfect uh, knowledge, not perhaps, and you need quite a sophisticated, ordered understanding in order to achieve, um, the balance to engage in a kind of creative potential. Um, which, you have to also have a kind of stomach for mistakes, and mistakes will also mean that there will be, let's say, negative repercussions, but that those repercussions don't overshadow the understanding, but it does lead to, let's say, a dynamic of experience, which is not just merely a robotic or mechanical cranking out of some formula, uh, that requires an active and a lively engagement, on such things. Anyway, um, and these are things that perhaps are more related to things like politics and statecraft and systems that human beings have to, or institutions and structures that human beings have to produce. And I think that that's probably more closely where the rebus is somewhat found. And perhaps when we get those things right, we can also do other great magical things, or seemingly sort of magical things that won't be regarded as so magical because they're only magical in the sense at the moment that they're unfathomable because we know that there's so much endemic corruption and lack of integrity in our structures that we can only imagine that if we had such technical feats, that there would, sort of, there would be a kind of dystopian sort of correlate with those capacities. They would almost be inevitable, because there's just a kind of a fundamental lack of development and maturity, or a kind of imbalanced structure which is based on sort of scapegoating problems and having collective diversions and blah blah blah. Anyway, so it is interesting as well that, I think that there is an interesting case to be made that, bipolar type 1 perhaps does have somewhat. It's interesting that the descriptions of Jesus Christ as well could, some people have made parallels that, oh, that looks like mania, or that, what is being described here seems slightly manic. The not eating, and what seems to be the kind of excitability that can be interpreted in how some of the disciples seem to be commenting on the status or at least the psychological condition of the person living 2,000 years ago. I don't want to say Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ is a slightly larger category than a single person. Anyway, I guess I've spoken enough about this. But yeah, there are other conclusions that I can also draw from some of these things, if my models on metagram are correct, is that the primary counter offer and the emergent response, they're being inverse to one another. There are only a certain number of inverse relationships, which means that I think that there are only 3. Which means that, they're 3 out of 12. No, wait, I can't say that. No, it is 3 out of 12. And each of those 3 has 2 emotional tones. So that means that 3 times 2 is 6. Sorry, they're 3 pairs. So if they're 3 pairs, that means that there are 6 cognitive functions, which means there are 12 emotional tones. That's quite a bit. Because you could either be on one side of it or on the other side of it. So that is basically half of them. But anyway, I was thinking that could be a way to subcategorize types as to why there are almost natural divisions within societies and organizations in having vastly different characters that are perhaps even slightly opposed to one another, because essentially some people's emergent responses is going to fall on one side and other people's emergent responses are going to fall on another side. And so if some of these divisions can sort of roughly line up into certain dichotomies along certain dimensions, you're going to get a kind of bifurcated set of organizations, or at least institutions or organizations that have kind of sentiments. And that might simply have to do with sort of competing biases, that one group's bias will be to perhaps jettison or divert or scapegoat a field circuit. And it might be asymmetrical, because it might only be one half of those people, because there is a peculiar distribution within the field circuit. So you could almost probably diagnose most societies as falling into perhaps the same kind of vortex of corruption, as essentially that there is a particular field circuit which is especially prone to being scapegoated by a kind of the preponderance of just the mass of people that fall into one dichotomy over another. So that just on a purely numerical sort of basis, there are more personality styles in existence who have a tendency towards ganging up on a particular field circuit and scapegoating that, or parasitically slowing that down so that they can speed up their field circuits. Something like that. Anyway.